So in this tutorial, we will be going through how to deal with a record that has been inherited from a previous database, so Hydro2K, IC2K, SISAL, whatever. So it is already showing up in our Hydroclimate 2K database on the QC sheet, but it does not yet have our interpretation metadata, and also hasn't been checked that it does indeed pass the criteria for inclusion for our specific database. Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. Okay. So I won't be there's a few things here that are there's a bit of assumed knowledge. I won't be getting into what a lipid file is. There are great resources for that already. I'll pop a link to one video in below. But there are some other documents that I strongly suggest you read or be familiar with already before this tutorial. Otherwise, there are a couple of things that might not make sense. And all of those sit here in the top level of our project drive. So here I'm showing you, this is our Hydroclimate 2K project Google Drive, which hopefully you have access to. And in the top level here, there's sort of all important guides, definition sheets that really step through every part of this process. So for example, here we have this Google Doc, guidelines for assessing records already in the compilation. That's everything I'm about to go through now, just in written form, so you can go back to that later. Definitions for the various metadata fields. This really important Google Slides, which explains the difference between a data set and a variable. So hopefully you're already familiar with this concept that a data set can contain more than one variable. For example, one lake core, that will be a data set, might have delta 18, delta 13C, and some XRF data. All of those variables sit within one data set. Various other things. And there are also these little schematics which just summarize the workflow for assessing records for inclusion in our Hydroclimate 2K database, adding the interpretation metadata. So this is the workflow we're about to follow. In the same way that when we add a new record, a data set has its own folder that moves through the workflow. It contains always at least two things, the publication and a notes doc. We skip a lot of the steps if the records here of the workflow, if the record's already included. It's inherited from an existing database, but the dataset folder will start in this folder number 1, where we're reviewing it for inclusion, and then it will go straight to either number 5, which means, yes, we're going to include this record in our database, and you'll be working on the interpretation metadata, or to folder 6, which is you have assessed that record and determined that it is not suitable for inclusion in our database, and so it should be removed. Okay, so that's the summary of the workflow. Now, there is one more thing that we need to you really need to have a handle on before we continue, and that is the QC sheet. So hopefully you're familiar. If you're watching this video with a lipid, you understand that a lipid file has the actual data values and the associated ages, maybe depths, as well as a lot of metadata of different types. So site level metadata, latitude, longitude, site name, and so forth, and then the interpretation metadata. What the QC sheet is it contains all of the metadata for all of the variables in all of the data sets. Okay, and so we can find the QC sheet. So here we're in the top level of our project folder. There's this folder QC sheets, and here is the current QC sheet. This is the master sheet that is connected directly to the database. And I'll talk a bit more about what that means in a second. But so it's huge. You can see it's got lots of columns, thousands of rows. And so here there is one row for every variable of every data set. So for example, you can see here, this is one data set that has multiple different variables. There we go, different isotopes, whatever. And then there is one column, there's one column for every metadata field. So we have the sort of site level stuff, the data set name, latitude, longitude, and so forth. Then the variable information, you know, what the actual proxy is. And then further across, we have our very important hydroclimate 2K interpretation metadata. So this particular sheet, this is what we call the master QC sheet. And as I said, it's directly linked to the database. And what that means is that if you make a change to this sheet, that change will be reflected in the actual database the next time this sheet is used to update the database. So for example, if I were to change the archive type here to Coral, and then the sheet was, you know, then Nick McKay did a database update. In the next version of our database, that particular variable would be marked as a Coral instead of a lake sediment. So that's that. And that's why, so when you're happy with your metadata, you will be entering it into the master QC sheet, and that is the means by which the interpretation metadata is added to the record. But because, so you have to be a bit careful when you're putting things into this sheet, because you don't accidentally delete something or change something that shouldn't be changed. So while you're just working on the metadata, getting everything together, actually every archive team will have their own copy of this in their archive folder. That's a sort of sandbox, if you like. So that's where you can sort of work on your records and gather up all the metadata without fear of disrupting the actual database. And then when it's done, you can copy it over to the master QC sheet where those changes will be reflected in the database. So I'll just show you an example of that. I'm in the Lake team, so I'll show you the Lakes working QC sheet. So here it is, working QC sheet, Lake sediment, but all of your archive teams should have one of these in your folder. And you'll see it is an exact copy of the column structure of the master QC sheet. So here you can be working on your record, gathering all of the metadata, and then when you're happy with it, then just pop over to the master and copy it in. Okay. Just before we start, there's one other thing that's really important here. So there's your working QC sheet. All of the archive teams will also have this thing called the workflow overview. And what this is essentially a tracker that shows what data sets are being worked on by somebody in the archive team and at what stage they are at. So here you can see we have the data set name. So these are all data sets that are currently being worked on by the Lake team. Lots of them, it's good to see. Whether or not that record was inherited from an existing database. So, you know, we've got a whole lot of new records being added here. We've got a couple going through that are already in the database. And then at what stage of the workflow these are at. And then across here we have any notes and the person who is responsible for working on that record. Now, it is extremely important, as you'll see in a moment, that this is kept up to date. So, you know, you can come here and see what records are being worked on or have already been worked on, what's been assessed. We'll be able to see here if a record has been checked already but rejected from the database for whatever reason. Very important that this is kept up to date. Okay, so that's that. All right, I reckon we can get going. So the first thing we want to do when we are going to, you know, maybe you've got a spare hour or you think, oh, okay, I'm going to have a look at one of the records that's already, you know, that's been inherited from ISO2K or whatever, and check whether it is good for our database and also add the interpretation metadata. The first thing you would do is actually to go to the master QC sheet. Okay, and because it's here that you'll be able to see what is currently in the database. You can see there's a column down here, BD, which is most recent compilation, and that will tell you if that's been inherited from somewhere else. So here we've got some from the Holocene abrupt change or lake status, SISAL, there's ISO2K further down there, various things. Okay. Now, to make things easier, you can actually filter this according to your own archive type. However, please, if you do this, then remember to unfilter when you're done. It's very common that people do not do that, but just remember that this sheet is shared by everyone, by the whole group, all 100 or so of us. And so if anyone messes it up, it can be very confusing. Always leave it how you found it. The same goes if for whatever reason you're hiding columns. It's even more important. Always remember to unhide any columns when you're done. Anyway, so I'm going to see, I'll just, filter to only show the lake sediment records. There we go. I'm going to have a look at this record, Alberca Lake. Let's see what we've got there. All right, now I'm just going to show you, it's nice to check this particular field over here. There's a particularly important column that you'll get very familiar with called in this, it's called in this compilation. And so a variable within a data set will actually only show up as being part of our hydroclimate 2K database if there is a true flag in this column. So when you're selecting a data set for assessment, you can either be choosing one that is currently flagged true to check that should be the case, and then add our interpretation metadata, or you can also, of course, look at one that doesn't have the true flag and see if we should be adding that flag. Okay. Anyway, so I'm gonna have a look at this. Let's see. So this is a lake sediment core. We can see there's 3 variables here. So this is an XRF record. And currently one of those is flagged as true for in this compilation. Now, the first thing that we want to do is the very first thing, I'm going to go to the lake sediment archive team folder, and now I want to add this to the workflow overview. Actually, sorry, back up. Before that, I need to check that somebody isn't already working on this. Okay, so what's it called? This is the dataset name, Alberca Lake. Okay, looks like we're all good. So I will add it here. This data set name, so this is the convention we follow for putting records through our workflow, and it is the site name, and then a full stop, and then the name of the first author, and then a full stop, and then the year of the publication. So here we can have Alberca Lake, the site name, then a full stop, then Wogal, the first author, and then 2019, the year of publication. Okay, so I'm going to add a new entry to show. Okay, now I'm working on this. Yes, it is inherited from existing database. I'm about to put it in step 1, need to review. It's me who's working on it. In case anyone has a question about that, I'm just going to write it's an XRF record. Okay. And while we're here, I'm actually going to put it straight into our working QC sheet. So remember that your working QC sheets are an exact copy of the master QC sheet. So I can actually just copy that and then paste it straight into the working sheet. There we go. So now we've got there. And now, I mean, even from now, I could be working on this. I could be I could be adding things in here to our environment, to our hydroclimate 2K interpretation metadata, whatever. Okay, so that's that. All right, so I have added this to our workflow overview. I've copied the data across into the working QC sheet. The next step is to make a folder for this record in number 1, need to review. So that folder, oops, that's not what we want. Oh, good Lord. That folder follows this same naming convention. So the site name, then a full stop, then the name of the first author, then a full stop, and then the year. It's very easy when you're looking at a record that's already that's been inherited, because generally the data set name will be in there already, so you can just copy it. Okay, and make that new folder. And then immediately there are two things that need to go in this folder. The first is a notes document where you'll make any notes about what's happening with the record, your thoughts, anything, you know, really. But it's important that we have this. I just like to give it the same name as the folder. And then we also need to add the publication. So again, when we're working with a record that's been inherited from an existing database, this is quite easy because one of the metadata fields is actually the DOI of the publication. So we could just go straight to this. And there it is. So it's a bit easier. I actually did this in advance. So I downloaded the paper, and I would be adding that here to the folder. Okay, so those are the first steps when you're looking to assess a record that's been inherited from an existing database. You check, go to the QC sheet, master QC sheet, choose a record, check that no one's working on it already, add it to the workflow overview, copy across all of the variables, don't forget that, copy across all of the variables from that data set into your working QC sheet, and then make this new folder for the data set in number 1, need to review, that has a notes document and the paper. Now, there are a few things I like to put in the notes document straight away, so I'll always date these. So today is the 29th of July. I'll note that this record was inherited from the Holocene database, and that there are 3 variables included. So titanium, calcium on titanium, there we go, just a few things. And that of these, one calcium and titanium is the only one that is marked currently as in this compilation. Okay, so that's that. The next thing we want to do, so we've got the paper, we've got a notes document, we're all good. The next thing we need to do is to have a look at the paper and determine whether or not this record passes our Hydroclimate 2K criteria for inclusion. Okay. All of these things I like to do in the notes document. So in this compilation, and that will be yes or no. Okay, and so now I'm going to assess the record. Now, let's see. So back here, where I'm back in the top level of our Hydroclimate 2K project folder. There is this doc here, which is criteria for dataset inclusion in the database. So this is what we'll be assessing the dataset against. So there are a few criteria. The first is that the primary interpretation of the record in the publication is that it is a hydroclimate record, so not temperature or some other thing, hydroclimate. And then we have a couple of sort of resolution criteria. So the first is that the record has to have 50 unique years included within the past 2,000 years. And then there's there's a chronological criterion related to how good the chronological control is of the record. I'm not going to read it out aloud. You can have a look at this yourself. Although just a reminder that in many cases, the data in these inherited records, it might extend way back beyond the past 2,000 years, totally fine. It's just that we perform this assessment only on the common era portion of that data set. Okay, so for this, we looked at the paper. I'm just going to open that up. I actually had a look at this paper in advance just to check these things. But, so you'd scroll through. When I'm reading the paper and assessing both to, determine whether or not this this data set should be included in our compilation, and also then to fill in the interpretation metadata, I like to sort of highlight the various important things, as you can see I've done here. So yeah, I've got some radiocarbon dates, and so you'd have you can see it definitely passes the number of data points in the common era criterion. And I checked already, and it also passes our chronological criteria, and it is indeed primarily a hydroclimate record. So I would, as I'm finding each of these things, as I'm reading the paper, I would say, okay, yes, so core passes the chron criterion, and then and I keep reading, and I'd find out the core passes the resolution criterion, and then I'll keep reading and find, oh, yep, the authors have interpreted this data, the XRF data, in terms of hydroclimate, and yep, core passes the interpretation criterion. Okay, and so we've passed the first hurdle, which is that, yep, at least one of the variables in this data set fulfills all the criteria, and therefore we will be including it. So if you're assessing a record that has lots of different variables, if only one of those passes the criteria, so one of the four or two of the four, that's totally fine. Remember, for that you can use this compilation flag and just have true against the fields that are suitable, and either false or leave empty any variables that either aren't interpreted primarily as hydroclimate, or there may be fewer measurements, so it doesn't pass the resolution criterion. And that is fine. Okay. Now, there are a few, things that will come up here and there. So, for example, I can see that when this was added to whatever previous compilation it came from, the authors they put in just these three variables. But when I was reading this paper, I noticed that actually there were other things that were measured. For example, there was this delta 18 and various things. In the case of this particular paper, I sort of dug a little bit deeper and found that these data had actually come from the NOAA database. So I was just thinking, so I went to NOAA just to figure out why maybe only these three variables have been included. So this is the repository, the NOAA repository for this particular data set. And I found that, it was only those three variables that were made publicly available. So, in this case, you can, do what seems right to you. You could just go ahead with the data that are already in there, and that's fine. Make a note of it. So more than these three variables included in the application data. NOAA. I like to log everything in this notes document. And I think I actually am going to email the authors of this paper and just ask if they would mind sharing this delta 18 data, just because in the paper they also interpret the delta 18 in hydroclimate terms, so it would be nice to include. So I would make a note here. I plan to email the authors to request delta 18 data. Okay, and when I send that email, I'll note that in the notes document as well, and wait till the authors get back to me. Okay, and so, I could wait, but while I'm doing that, I can be going through the paper to make a note of how these variables have been interpreted. So, you go through, there we go, we inferred that variations in the calcium to titanium ratio react with orthogenic precipitation of carbonates due to evaporative concentration. So there's all these sort of little statements in the paper that you will use to determine what should be entered into the metadata fields. So I did this in advance, so I don't have to bore you with it. But this is sort of what I figured out, that, the direction of the relationship, dynamical driver, that sort of thing. And so I can be adding all of that into the working QC sheet. I'm not going to do it now, but I would, say the calcium titanium. I forget what it was. I think it was evaporation or something. And filling in those negative. Yeah. So in this particular tutorial, I'm not going to go through what specifically goes in all of these fields. I actually get into that in more detail in the sister tutorial to this, the one where for adding a brand new data set to the database. So you could watch that if you like. But essentially what you're doing at this point for a record inherited from an existing database is going through the paper and finding all the information that you need to fill in our hydroclimate 2K interpretation data. So the environment interpretation and the supporting information, the climate interpretation and the supporting information, and then the dynamical system and the supporting interpretation. At the same time, you're checking if the true flags here are in the right place. So I might find that actually all of these variables are hydroclimate related, in which case they should all be flagged as true for inclusion in our database, or maybe just one of them, whatever, that's totally fine. And that is what you'll be doing. Okay, and yeah, I just like to use this to sort of write my reasoning as I go for why I've entered a particular thing in a metadata field. Okay, but I forgot to say, so you remember the first thing I did here was to assess whether or not this record was suitable for inclusion in the database. When I've said, I've decided, yes, it is, I would actually take this folder out of number 1, need to review, which is where it sits when you're assessing whether or not it's suitable for inclusion, and take it straight to folder 5, added to lipid verse. Now, the reason I might not do this immediately is because, remember, I said that this particular record, there are 3 variables included, but the authors actually publish more. In which case I might, decide to request that and wait to see if I get that data, in which case that record would keep sitting. Actually, I move it here to number 2, need data, and the record would sit there until I got the data, the additional data, or the authors got back to me and said, no, thanks, we don't want to share it. In which case I would move it over here to add it to lipid-verse. Okay, we're going to assume we're going to go with what's already in the database, what's already included in that data set. Oops, where did it go? Okay, sorry, I'm just going to go back to that. Okay, so here's my folder. Say I've decided, yeah, this record's good. We are going to keep that one in the compilation. I just need to add the interpretation metadata. So we would move that straight to folder 5, contents, added to lipid verse. Okay. If you're familiar with the process at all, you'll remember that there are some of these steps, so that reviewing, getting data, deciding whether to add to compilation or reject, that sit in our archive teams. But these 2 folders, in lipid pending lipid verse and number 5 added to lipid verse, they are shared by all archive teams. So they sit here in right under the main project drive. Okay, so I've moved that record to number 5, add to lipid verse, and there are 2 more columns here that are very important in the workflow overview sheet, which is H here, that all metadata have been added to the working QC sheet. And then once you've done that and you're happy that everything is correct, you've checked it all, then you would simply copy that into the relevant fields of the master QC sheet, and then put across here. And at that point, we would be completely done. This record would have been checked, metadataed, added to the database. That's it. That's that record dealt with. So I know that was fairly long, but in essence, this process is quite straightforward. You're going to the master QC sheet, picking out a record, adding it to the workflow overview, checking that one or more variables in that data set pass the criteria for inclusion, and then going through the publication and finding all the information you need to fill in our hydroclimate 2K interpretation metadata. And then when that's all done, so you'll be gathering that up here in your archives working QC sheet, copy that across to the master QC sheet, where on the next update, it will be added officially to the database. Of course, don't forget to mark these particular flags. Now, the one thing I haven't covered here, which I'm going to talk about separately, actually, is how to deal with a data set that was inherited from an existing compilation, but you have decided is not suitable for inclusion in our hydroclimate 2K database. So if that happened, there are a few things that are quite straightforward. So it would have been sitting here, number one, need to review. You'd check the paper, you'd find, oh, actually, there are not enough chronological control points in the common era, or whatever the case may be. In that situation, you would move that to this folder here, number 6, reject from compilation. You would make a note in the notes file of why, the specific reason that that record was rejected from the compilation. You would mark that in the workflow overview. So if it were this, you would put a cross in this column here, 6, reject from compilation. That's very important because it means that if somebody else went to review that record, they'll be able to come here, see that you'd already had a look and you'd rejected it for whatever reason. They could even go to the folder here, number 6, and have a look at your notes document and see why you rejected it. Then there will be a little process to go through to have that record removed from the compilation. I'm going to put up a separate tutorial for that, but don't worry about it now. If you come across one of those before that tutorial is up, that's fine. Just move the record to folder 6, make all the notes, and you can deal with actually removing it later. Maybe put a note in the workflow that it hasn't actually been removed yet, but it's been flagged for removal. Okay. I'm just going to stop sharing. I hope that is reasonably clear. In many ways, this is more straightforward than adding a new record because a lot of the metadata already filled in. You're just grabbing the paper and checking that it qualifies for our database and adding the new metadata. Yeah, good luck and happy record collecting.